Good morning, everyone. We're going to give it a minute or two more. We're expecting just a couple more board members to join. All right, confirming that folks can hear me.
We can hear you.
All right, awesome. Thanks. Working through some technical stuff here. Awesome. Good. All right, Chair Frommer, I see that we do have a quorum, so we can get started whenever you are ready.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. So I'm seeing Director Block. Director Trowbridge is here. Director Garcia is absent. Not seeing Director Jones. Director Averill's here. We have our friends from CDOT and the Energy Office and Director Coffin. Great. All right. First up on the agenda, we have an opportunity for public comment. Is anyone here for public comment? If so, come off mute or raise your hand.
I don't believe we had any requests for public comment this month.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so next on the agenda is a decision item, the approval of the minutes for the September 24th board meeting. Any questions or discussion on that item? Seeing none, so I'll make a motion to approve those minutes.
Second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Director Coffin. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, seeing none, the minutes have been approved. All right. Gonna kick it over to Kay Kelly for an update.
Thank you, Matt. So my update this month, so you can go to the next slide, please, Desiree. Thank you. We did post a job announcement for a Clean Transit Enterprise Manager. That job announcement closed on September 12th. We've completed 2 rounds of interviews with candidates and hope to have an offer out within the next week or so. And we also hope that that staff member is going to be onboarded in time for our next board meeting. So good candidates and excited to have a full-time staff member for CTE relatively soon. Next on the list, just a reminder that CTE is required to submit an annual report to the legislature on our activities. We've been doing these since the inception of the enterprise. The report is pretty straightforward. It's basically our accomplishments from each calendar year. So the 2024 report has been drafted. I will be circulating that for the board's awareness via email, probably sometime this week. And then we do, there's an internal review process that document goes through before we submit it to the legislature in December. So just FYI that we are checking the box on that annual deliverable. So the image you see on the slide is a snapshot of our updated public accountability dashboard. That's also one of the requirements of the enterprise to post information about our funding programs and the status. So this includes our newly approved capital awards. So the dashboard is accessible from our website. And then the website itself has also just been recently updated to include the language about the new SB 230 oil and gas production fees as well. So if you haven't visited the website in a while, go check it out, and you can look at the updated dashboard as well. In terms of board appointments, so the governor's boards and commissions office has not yet announced appointments or reappointments to the CTE board of directors. The office is very busy. There are many, many, many boards and commissions that they appoint folks to every year. So just as an FYI, all the current board members are going to continue to serve until they're reappointed or replaced. So we thank you for continuing to be with us until the boards and commissions office makes those announcements, which we expect to be relatively soon. But just so you know, that's the status. If they haven't made the appointment yet, your term is still in effect. And then the next thing on my list is the future board meeting scheduling. So with work about to ramp up for the oil and gas production fees, I've been talking about this for a while, but we are going to be returning to a monthly meeting cadence for our board meeting. So we are looking at the last Tuesday or Wednesday of the month for our new standing meeting time. So with the holidays coming up, I feel like the last Tuesday and Wednesday of the month might be a little difficult with the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays in that time frame. That may trip us up a bit through the end of the calendar year, and will in future years too if we do that meeting cadence. But we would like to probably do one more ad hoc scheduled meeting in early December. And then move to that new kind of last Tuesday or Wednesday of the month cadence starting in January. And then probably in future years, we'll look at combining the November and December meetings into kind of an early December time slot so that we avoid the holiday conflicts in future years too. So just wanted to poll the board quickly if anyone has any recurring conflicts on the last Tuesday or Wednesday of the month that would prohibit that time from working for them. Not seeing any feedback.
Hey, Kay,
Yes.
this is Rick Coffin. I'm curious, do you have a particular time in mind, like kind of morning like this, or would it just depend on the month?
It would be a standing meeting time. So, I don't think we've dialed in the time yet, but we're just kind of looking at those particular days of the month. So if anyone has conflicts like in the morning on those days, we could look at the afternoon. But if everyone says those days are generally open, we can schedule from that information.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I have a few standing meetings on those days, so I can either email you those times or maybe we can set up a doodle to find the best time for everyone on the board.
Okay, that works. So we will get a scheduling poll out, but again, we're just for the ability for the public to participate and have more predictability in the schedule for the board. We do want to kind of set a, last Tuesday of the month at 2:00 or whatever that time ends up being, so that way folks can plan around it. And then in terms of scheduling our December meeting, this will be kind of the last ad hoc scheduled meeting. We obviously wouldn't want to put it in the last week of November or December with the holidays. We're looking at Wednesday, December 11th from 11:30 to 1. If folks can kind of check their calendars and see if that works, we can get that scheduled as well. So, and folks can text me or chat me in the meeting conversation if anyone has conflicts, but that's kind of our tentative plan unless we hear that we cannot get a quorum of board members. All right, and then just the last couple things on my report. So with the oil and gas production fee topic, we are continuing our administrative preparations. Hiring that enterprise manager, which I already mentioned, is going to be a big part of kind of getting our feet under us and starting to move forward on the startup work for the new oil and gas fees. We are also looking at bringing on some consultant support to help with stakeholder outreach and some of the technical aspects of formula development. Once the enterprise manager is hired, that individual will be 100% dedicated to leading all of this work. And I expect that we'll have much more to share at our December and January meetings. But just so you know, now that we have the startup loan in place and we're about to hire that enterprise manager, we can really start digging in on the oil and gas work in the coming months. And for retail delivery fee work, we have a couple topics on the agenda today related to our upcoming funding opportunity for the ZEV transition planning grant. So I won't say too much more about that, but know that we have a guest speaker from the town of Breckenridge, and then also Mike King to give us the next steps on the ZEV planning grants. So that is my report. Does anyone have any questions for me? All right, handing it back to you, Chair.
All right. Thanks, Kay. Okay, so let's move into an enterprise financial update. Kay and Ryan, are you on?
Yes. Yes. So there is the attached CTE budget actual through September. So as you see there, with the Clean Transit Retail Delivery Fee approximately being 2.3 million, and most of the expenses relating to attorney general fees and staff salaries. We are still in the process of getting the TC loan to cover the oil and gas fees. That is currently in our contracts division. So as soon as that agreement gets signed, then we'll disperse the funds, and we can then we'll start reporting on the other fund where the loan gets deposited. Other than that, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, then I will turn it over to Sam and Ryan.
Hi, everyone. Sam Foster in the Office of Financial Management and Budget. And I'll go over the revenue from the last month and then the current cash balance. So next slide. Okay, so for the month of September, revenue came in just under 902,000 from the retail delivery fee. And then on the left, we've got our up-to-date forecasts. So for fiscal year 26, next year, current forecast 12.9 million. And then the oil and gas production fee forecasts are still what they've been the past couple meetings, still totaling up to around 56.7 million. Can move on to the current cash balance on the next slide. Just a snapshot of where the current cash balance is. Same spending authority, 18.1, but the current cash balance as of almost 2 weeks ago, just under 22 million. And if there are any questions, I can pass off to Ryan for an update on the oil and gas fee forecasts.
All right, thanks, Sam. My name is Ryan Long. I'm a revenue analyst within OFMB. I'm primarily responsible for maintaining our revenue forecasts for CDOT and enterprise revenue sources. If we could go to the next slide really quick. Thank you. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of our current oil and gas fee production forecast. So we're primarily using EIA data on price and production data to forecast these revenue sources for the next few years. We maintain a quarterly revenue forecast, so we'll be updating this forecast every quarter. So the next update will be in December. And kind of this chart kind of shows our current forecast for the next 2 fiscal years. The revenue in the first fiscal year is limited because of Proposition 117. So this forecast could vary depending on how much retail delivery fee revenue we get. To the extent retail delivery fee revenue increases, then it might decrease the amount of oil and gas fee revenue we can bring in, or vice versa. And then starting in FY27, we're forecasting right around $114 million in revenue from these fees. If you can go to the next slide, please. And then kind of with these fees, I really wanted to highlight the variability of the revenue forecast for these fees in particular. The middle line in the graph kind of shows what our current baseline forecast is. And that assumes for FY27, it assumes about $85 per barrel for the price of oil. And then going forward, it's about $80 per barrel for the price of oil. But the lines above and below show kind of what the fee would be within the next tiers. So the line above assumes $90 to $95 per barrel, and below is $70 to $75 per barrel. All of these are very possible outcomes for the price of oil, and it could lead to very wide differences in the amount of revenue that we bring in. Additionally, on a quarterly basis, the fee will be updated on a quarterly basis, so there will be a lot of variability within fiscal years themselves too. But with that, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I think that's what I had.
Thank you, Ryan. Super helpful. Do you just kind of thinking ahead here? I'm just looking at this graph. It looks like there's sort of a potential kind of $50 million window here between the low scenario and the high scenario, because the production fee is linked to the price per barrel of oil, which fluctuates. Are you what are sort of the best practices for us in terms of managing our budget over time and making sure there's enough, even if there's a dip in revenue and we hit that low scenario, maybe FY28? Is there a good rule of thumb there to keep a 10% cushion or something?
I think outside of just generally budgeting conservatively and keeping a cushion, I think maybe just kind of coming back and updating the budget frequently potentially, and just keeping a really close eye on it. Since we'll be releasing kind of quarterly revenue updates, you'll see how the revenue is kind of looking for the next kind of few quarters. So I think just being on top of it and being willing to make quick updates as needed.
All right, do we have any other questions for Ryan or Kay or Sam on the financial update?
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
I was just asking the group if there were any other questions, but is this your last slide, Ryan? I forgot to ask that too.
Yeah, this was the last slide.
Okay.
I think I'm up next.
Okay.
Great. So I'm going to lead the conversation here on our proposed budget for next year, but I might be calling on my OFMB colleagues for their subject matter expertise here as well. So CDOT is in the midst of our annual budget setting process, which is outlined here on this slide on the timeline. So we are at that orange dot where we need to develop our budget for CTE, our proposed budget. And that is a decision item for the board today to approve that proposed budget. So once the proposed budget is approved by the CTE board, the CDOT Transportation Commission will include our proposed budget in the total CDOT budget proposal, which goes to the governor's office and the legislature. The TC approves the total CDOT budget on their agenda in November. Then there's this review period in November and December before the proposed budget goes to the governor's office and the legislature on December 15th. Then in January, we move into the final budget review stage, where we'll come back to the CTE board with any updates or changes new assumptions, other things that we've learned before we have to approve our final budget at our February meeting. We approve it at the February meeting so that it can be included again in that overall budget for CDOT that goes to the commission for approval at the March meeting, and then goes to the governor's office and the legislature by April 15th, so that the budget can be signed by the end of this fiscal year and be ready to go for the start of fiscal year 26, which starts on July 1st of 2025. So lots of deadlines, but in general, we're in the proposed budget phase. For now, in January, we'll switch to the final budget phase. We need to do a proposed budget approval this month, a final budget approval at our February meeting. So next slide shows the different pieces of our budget. At a high level, we reflect revenues and expenses. So for revenue, we have our existing Clean Transit Retail Delivery Fee and our new oil and gas production fee, which is going to take effect for fiscal year 26 that begins July 1st of 2025. So for expenses, at a high level, we've got three big categories there. The first one is that administration and agency operations category. This is the stuff that is the day-to-day kind of keep the lights on, keep the work flowing, administrative costs for the enterprise. So things like salary for staff who support our grant making work, the staff who manage our budget, who prepare the materials for the meetings, who take notes on the meetings, those kinds of things. Plus, this also includes the fees we pay for our Attorney General's office, legal support, the required annual financial audits, any travel or meeting costs that we have for in-person meetings. So this is kind of the cost centers, the administrative budget items. This has typically been a small percentage of the retail delivery fee revenue. But with the new oil and gas production fee revenue, we are going to split the admin and agency operations costs between the two revenue streams. We're estimating that it's going to be about 70% charged to the oil and gas production fee. That is a much larger pot of funding, and about 30% to the retail delivery fee. That's kind of our assumption for the coming fiscal year. We can always make adjustments, but that's kind of our baseline assumption. And this is based on really what we think it will take to administer our existing and ongoing zero emission transit grant portfolio that's funded through retail delivery fees, and what it'll take to stand up and begin execution on the new oil and gas production fee portfolio. So that's our starting assumption, that we'll split admin cost 70-30. The next category is the contingency reserve. Director Frommer was getting at this a little bit when he was asking Ryan Long about the kind of unpredictability or variability, I should say, of the oil and gas production fee. So if folks remember, we did outline contingency reserve in the 10-year plan as part of the original retail delivery fee revenue stream. So this was when we were seeing some very extreme cost escalations for vehicles. I think the price increases from one year to the next for transit vehicles were up nearly 30% in a single year. So we had a lot of capital projects in our general transit portfolio where we didn't have enough money to make that project whole because the costs escalated so significantly in a single year. So the board wanted to build in some reserve funds to be able to kind of react if that happened again in the future, or if we encountered any situation where we had unforeseen costs. So the board set our contingency reserve at 10% of the retail delivery fee. So that is our assumption, that we will continue to keep 10% of the retail delivery fee for contingency. We have not outlined any contingency for the oil and gas fee yet, but that's a possibility that we could do that at the final budget stage. But at this point, we haven't done any development on that portfolio and haven't put that into the budget assumptions. The final aspect of our budget is the fun stuff, the programmed funds. So this is the pot of funding we pass on to transit agencies in the form of grants. Again, we have our existing grant portfolio from the retail delivery fee, and we'll be adding the new grant programs as part of the new oil and gas production fee for fiscal year 26. So at a high level, that's kind of what you see in the different categories. So the next slide is going to break this out by dollar figures. So Desiree, if you can go to the next slide. And I've also added some call out boxes off to the side to highlight what is different from prior year budgets that the board has approved, just to kind of show where we've been and how this budget might be slightly adjusted from prior years. So at the top, the total revenue for fiscal year 26 is estimated to be just over $70 million. The revenue line has grown rather significantly since fiscal year 25. So because this does take into account the new oil and gas production fee, along with the increasing revenue collections from the retail delivery fee. It also has the $600,000 startup loan from the Transportation Commission to help us bridge the first half of the fiscal year before any of the oil and gas production fee funds reach our bank account, so to speak. So total revenue, 70 million at the top. The next green line is our admin and agency operations costs. Those are estimated to be about 1.68 million. That's a total of the yellow lines below. And those yellow lines cover, again, salary, legal fees, admin expenses. So our salary costs are anticipated to be higher as we add additional grant programs and continue to execute on our existing grant program. Those salary costs have gone up since last year's budget. We also included some additional budget for professional services to cover the support of some consultants, which we anticipate we're going to need for some of the stakeholder outreach work and some of the technical work associated with the oil and gas production fee startup. So that line item is slightly larger than prior years. I didn't put a call out box for this, I realized when I was looking at it this morning. But I probably should have. We also reflect the repayment of the TC loan with interest under our admin and operating costs. So that was the loan that was approved at the last meeting. We do expect to fully repay the TC loan shortly after the SB 230 revenue starts reaching us in January of 2026. So that's reflected as an operating cost that will be paid back from the oil and gas production fee. The next kind of green line is the contingency reserve. So again, this is 10% of the total retail delivery fee revenue set aside for contingency. And then at the bottom, that leaves us about $67 million for our grant portfolios, about 11 million for retail delivery fee related grants, about 56 million for the oil and gas production fee portfolio. So I think it's important to us as an enterprise to ensure that the maximum amount of funds are going towards our business purpose and that we're really minimizing our administrative costs. So I always really carefully look at kind of the percentage admin versus the percentage that's going out as grants. If you add the kind of program funds and the contingency reserve, you'll see that we have about 98% of our total revenue going into our grant programs, and that kind of true work portfolio for the enterprise. So only about 2% administrative expenses. So I'll pause here. I've been talking a lot. Any questions or comments from the board? But the next slide is the proposed motion for the board to consider to accept the budget that you see here on the screen, the CTE proposed fiscal year 26 budget.
Thanks for that overview, Kay. I have one question. I think you kind of covered this, but the $250,000 for professional services, can you just say more about the idea of bringing in a consultant to assist with this work, as opposed to, doing that in-house at CDOT, keeping that person on board longer term?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think we're always very discerning about when we bring in consultants versus when we have full-time staff do the work. In the case of the stakeholder outreach associated with the retail I'm getting my fees mixed up, the oil and gas production fee, we think that's going to be a fairly intense process for, 6 to 8 months. And I don't believe that we don't have someone on staff who could kind of put all their work off to the side for that time and really be dedicated to this project. So I think that's a reason why we would bring in that person. We do certainly have folks who do stakeholder outreach, but not dedicated 100% to a program like this for this length of time. So we would we always will be interested in stakeholder feedback, getting more folks to participate in the meetings, continually checking in with stakeholders, things like that. That's something that we would probably have a more full-time person do, but the kind of intense work up front, we would bring a consultant in to do. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah, thanks.
Hey Kay, this is Rick. I have a quick question, not necessarily about the budget, but for the in-person meetings, has there been any thought as far as like where the meetings will be located? Like, would they be at CDOT, or are you thinking maybe different locations throughout the state? Maybe like including field trips, things like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I know we have only met virtually as a board so far. I think we would like to have, especially as we're having some of these conversations around the setup for the oil and gas production fee, having some more of those conversations about formula development in person, we think would be helpful. Our standard would be to have the meetings at CDOT headquarters. I think we could discuss whether having a meeting elsewhere would make sense, but the cost assumptions here are based on having a few commissioners outside of the Denver metro region who would need to travel to headquarters.
Okay.
And of
thanks.
course, if we ever do an in-person meeting, we would always have a virtual option as well for board members who might not be available to travel. So
Thanks.
Hey Kay, super quick question for you. Particularly with the oil and gas production fee money, boy, that's a lot of money coming in. That's awesome. I'm wondering how that might play into discussions around the development of the new statewide plan, the 10-year plan, things like that, and how we might. It just feels like this money's coming before that effort's going to be complete, and how we might, I don't know, maintain some flexibility to respond to what's happening in that plan and the recommendations that come out of that plan. It just seems like, I'm not complaining about the timing of things. It just seems a little awkward and maybe not optimum to be making decisions about how to spend the oil and gas production fee money before we have that plan complete. Just curious to see what your thoughts are on that.
yeah, really good question. And I think this is something that that is just persistent, right? Like CDOT has in any given month any number of federally required plans due on something, right? Multimodal plans, transit plans. There's a whole constellations of plans that are required. And the timelines don't always match up. And it's just kind of a fact of life. So I think we have really good guidance in the legislation on kind of what the priorities are and what the parameters are for the program development that we do need to do. And so I'm not terribly concerned that, everything's not going to, line up exactly perfectly. We seldom have a perfect world when we have all these many plans that have to interact. But it's a good question, and it's something that we'll definitely keep in mind as we're having the conversations, and something that I think the board will likely want some background and education on. I think we can bring in some presentations around kind of what the transit planning looks like, what we know about what agencies' needs are. And I think that'll be part of that kind of larger ongoing conversation that we kick off once we start digging in on the oil and gas production fees. So really good question.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, if there aren't any other questions from me, Desiree, you can probably go to the next slide and the board can discuss and deliberate on the budget.
All right, good discussion. Are there any other questions about the proposed budget before we move forward with the motion? All right, so I'll make a motion, and I'll move for the Clean Transit Enterprise to adopt the fiscal year 2026 proposed budget as presented by enterprise staff.
I'll second.
Thanks. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, not seeing any. Proposed budget's been approved. All right, and with that, we're going to hand it over to Andy Cotton with the town of Breckenridge to talk about their ZEV transition planning. Are you here, Andy?
Right here.
All right, welcome.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. So before we get started into the ZEV transition planning presentation that I have for you today, I just kind of wanted to give you all sort of a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. And these slides are as tailored for this committee on who I thought would be here today. If you all want any sort of deep dives into our ZEV transition plan itself, that's a completely different slide deck that I have available that I've given presentations on before. So this is going to be a very high level overview of it's like sort of the reasons why Town of Breck, in my opinion, wanted to get this study done, why we want to move to zero emission vehicles. So you can go ahead and Desiree and move to that next slide. And it's basically the same one. So you could go one more forward, please. Awesome. So I'll give you all just a real quick background on what we do here in Breckenridge. So we are the Free Ride Transit, and we operate 4 to 8 bus routes, which would just depend on season. In the summer, we're more along the lines of the 4 bus route. And in the winter, we go up to 8 bus routes. So that'll be starting here in just one more week. We have on those 8 bus routes over 1 million passengers every year. In fact, we're just about to get to that number right now. So kind of what I'm getting at is we have a high density population in a really small town, and a lot of people that need to use these buses for to get to work, go to their medical appointments, etc. And so with that said, we have a pretty large staff of between 35 to 50 employees, depending on the season. So this winter we'd be at, I think, 44 full-time bus drivers. So, and then some of the cards that we were dealt, 9,600 feet in elevation. So anyone that was just in Telluride at Castas Conference a couple weeks ago knows that Mountain Village, I think, is about 9,000 feet. So we are at 9,600 feet. And then with that, we expect to get an average snowfall of 350 inches. So this morning when I woke up, there was a little dusting outside and some more weather coming in today. All right, next slide, please. All right, so you can see our current state of buses right now. We have 16 buses that, it's actually 19 buses that we're using right now. So we have 12 diesels, 2 diesel hybrids, and 5 battery electric buses currently in our fleet. The way that we charge those buses is through depot chargers, which just means that they're stationary inside the bus barn. So we have a newer bus barn that we built just to house the BEVs, and that has 5 chargers in it. 2 of those are 60 kilowatt and 3 are the 120 kilowatts. And I joke with some of the staff, if we plug all those in at the exact same time, that the power in Breckenridge starts to, the lights start to dim a little bit. So we try and stagger that as much as we can. Next slide, please. All right, now here's where I'll start some of the overview of kind of the thought behind why do we want zero emission vehicles in Breck, and what's our sort of our goal with that. So as I was explaining earlier, we have such a high density population on our main lines, and we run so many vehicles up and down these roads that we're really trying to reduce emissions in the core part of the town. And a lot of that is really coming from the buses themselves. So anyone that's ridden around on one of these newer style battery electric buses also knows that they're really quiet. So kind of the goal with that was how can we make sure that we're providing this great service to the passengers in Breck, but also give them a quieter means of getting to and from work, and also less emissions to their neighborhoods, right? Kind of the other part of that was, hey, are we gonna, like, as an organization, are we gonna save money here? And I think when we first started this, this plan was, yeah, there is going to be some cost savings there. Now, as Kay was kind of just mentioning, like with the 30% increase in buses, maybe that's going to take a little while to get there. So I'll get into that a little bit later. Our goal is to be fully electric by 2030. And that's a really aggressive goal. Is that really something that's obtainable? We'll kind of get into that. Next slide, please. All right, so why do we need this fleet transition plan? And why is this important not only for Breck but for other agencies? Because I'm really into this stuff, but how much of my day can I put towards it? How much of our staff can we put towards really figuring this out? I don't know that we wear many hats here. I might be running payroll in a day, and also making updates to our website, for instance, and working on a ZEV transition plan. So our time is certainly limited, as is all of yours, I'm sure, which is why I'll keep this under 15 minutes. And, we like to think that we know a lot about certain areas of battery electric buses, but do we really have like a deep knowledge of it? So I learned a ton through this study, stuff that I was like, wow, this is kind of shocking. And then another piece of this was the fleet transition plan really helped us get everyone together in the same room. So we had a lot of trouble kind of getting Xcel Energy involved in the process. They were happy to discuss it, but to get them up here and to get everyone in the same room was definitely a little bit more difficult. And then what do we need in terms of our fleet and our facilities? Next slide, please. This took a ton of time, this study, to get done. It took about 5 months, and we had weekly meetings with the agency that we used to conduct this study. Our total cost was, we got a really good value, in my opinion. Our total cost was $45,000, and almost all of that was funded through CDOT's ZEV Transition Planning Award. So this all happened before the CTE board was funding these studies. So I believe the total cost that we were able to fund through CDOT was $45,000. So it was great when we went to the RFP. We just said, this is how much we have to spend. So really minimal cost to our agency and a fantastic value that we got from this company. We went to RFP. The top proposal was Hatch Consulting. And what we really liked about that company was they had already completed some ZEV transition plans for some of these larger agencies, but they had a local person. It was funny when, and I've said this before, but what I thought was funny was they said, oh, Breckenridge, we have a local in your area that's going to help with this. And when I really dug in, the local was down in Denver. So anyone that lives in these mountain towns know that locals, it means that you're in Breck, you're in Summit County. But it was just kind of funny that whoever was proposing this thought that the local was, like my neighbor or something. And they were all really fantastic to work with through Hatch. So I definitely highly recommend them. Next slide, please. So just some of the details continued. Really, I had to be on my A game with getting data ready to produce or for this company. And I'm really a data-driven person to begin with. So for me to every day work on that, it was super fun. Really enjoyed it. We had site visits, a whole bunch of site visits from Hatch and the electric Xcel Energy, and then really needed to provide them with a lot of cold weather, hot weather data photos, and then a lot of usage details from our current EV fleet. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll kind of go through this quickly because it's all this shows is our intended date on the far right, replacement years of the vehicles that we have right now. So our study sort of lent itself almost to a 2030 date, basically by just replacing our buses when they were due for replacement. Next slide. This is crazy to me because some more data that gets produced from these studies is, hey, look, here's the current state of the EV industry, and here's what we project in the future. By 2030, we're going to have these buses, these 40-foot buses that have, over 600 kilowatts of battery. Of course, the usable is much less. And right now here, if you look at, we're in 2024, Gillig is already stating that they have buses that are, 686 kilowatts. So we knew this was not aggressive in its way of thinking. And the technology is really outpacing this exponentially. Next slide, please. All right. And then, so what this is going to show you right here is we don't really have a, it gets really cold here in Breck. We use a lot of kilowatts here per mile, 2.2 with a diesel heater, 3.16 with. And so that's some more of the data that you can expect as an agency of their modeling softwares on how you determine what size battery packs you're going to need. But our reality is that this could even be worse than that. So, I think the main takeaway from the whole plan, and I'll talk about this again briefly, is just that this was a roadmap, but we really have our eyes open here in Breck on some of the actual issues that we've encountered. Next slide, please. All right. What this basically shows you is just more of a timeline of when you should do these critical upgrades. We're going to need to rebuild a bus barn. We're going to need to do an electrical upgrade, order buses at these certain at these dates. Next slide, please. All right. So we're going to need 18 battery electric buses here in order to operate our entire route structure. 2 are going to need to be trolleys. And then our new bus barn, we're going to need 1 more charger. And our old bus barn is going to need a full rebuild, which was kind of a surprise, and 7 high-speed chargers with 2 dispensers each. Next slide, please. And really one of the big goals here was emissions reduction. So if you look at the top there, the diesel baseline is kind of what we're doing right now, or what we were originally doing. And then at the way bottom, if we get all these electric buses out here, the future fleet should be really have a massive reduction in emissions. Next slide, please. All right, everyone's favorite slide, the surprises. Yes, so I'll kind of just briefly talk through these. We were informed that we were going to need a complete facility teardown and rebuild, which was a little bit of a surprise to us. But based on the infrastructure inside that facility right now, it's just not feasible. The cost savings, I don't know. Maybe, I wouldn't say maybe not, but I would say it just is going to take longer than expected. We're going to need to optimize routes. We had been using the model of leasing our batteries from Proterra here from Phoenix, and that's not a great model. They said, use federal funding if you can, whatever funding you can find for that 80-20 split so that the 100% battery charge is not on your agency. And then, maybe there's some resistance to change here with the mechanics and the drivers themselves. So we got to keep an eye on that. And then facility and charging infrastructure maintenance. There's a lot there that is, we don't really know about. Next slide, please. All right, currently, here's what we have going on. We have 3 of our 5 Phoenix Proterra buses that are out of service. This is not really a huge surprise for anyone that's operating them. So we're working through that as best we can. But really, the new buses are still 2.5 years out. So even if we want to continue with our transition plan, we need funding now to be able to, order these buses that are going to take such a large amount of time to get. while our fleet currently ages. Unfortunately, as we all know, buses really take a beating, and 12 years, 500,000 miles comes quick on some of them. We also have quite a bit of mechanic training that we need to do, as our mechanics have, we have a good couple core of them, but 3 or 4 have changed in the last 2 to 3 years. And then 2030 timeline is super aggressive. Next slide, please. Continue the momentum is really what Hatch told us. We were the first agency in Colorado Mountain region to do BEVs. And so they really said, just continue with what you've been doing. The bus barn renovation is going to be super important, getting plans and designs for that. And some of the other things I've already talked about. So something we'd be looking forward to in the future is definitely getting a charging software on hand, which is what I was saying before. It was kind of funny, if you plug them in all at the same time, what happens? So a lot of great takeaways that we got from Hatch through this process. And then next slide. And then finally, why is this plan useful? Why do we need it? It really helped us get a great timeline of what we need to do and when. And then that data, just getting the deep dive of stuff that I didn't have time for, that we didn't have time for, as well as a full fleet assessment to get somebody here that can really assess the current state of your fleet and what you need to be doing, help you with route planning and vehicle acquisition strategy. I still keep in contact with Hatch all the time, and they have a really good pulse on the state of the industry, as well as helped us with a lot of driver and fleet mechanic training requirements and much, much more, which I can go into in depth in another time. Next slide. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm happy to take feedback for right now, questions. Yes, Matt, no problem. I can share the full transition plan with your group. And then, yes, Matt, also, yes, we did receive $2.9 million from the CTE to buy 7 more battery electric buses. So we are in great shape right now. And you're welcome. If there's no questions, feel free to head back to your normal programming.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Andy. Actually, I have a couple questions. Sorry, I could not unmute myself quickly enough. But thanks for providing all that information. Super helpful. Yeah, on one of your slides at the bottom, you mentioned reaching out to the energy providers early. Do you have a sense of like what kind of like the overall time frame is as far as like working with them and what it will be, to get any upgrades installed? Like, are you talking about like years in the process, or is that kind of unknown right now?
Good question. It's not unknown, and it's not years, which is great news. We work with Xcel Energy here in Summit County, and they have been very responsive. When we got the site visit, they were talking if you plan it the year before, you could have your utility upgrades by that following summer. So part of our issue up here, as well as probably with many of your areas, is ability to do things in the winter. So really getting it the year before, they should be your first call, really, is the bottom line when you're going through these plans.
Okay, thank you. And just one more question. What's typically like the plan for the diesel buses that are transitioned out? Like, are they sold? Is that something that's kind of built into your overall like kind of operations?
Yeah, so we just sent 2 buses. So basically it depends on how you're funded to replace them. And we were lucky enough to be able to get Volkswagen funds for some of our old buses. And when you get that type of funding, those buses would need to be destroyed. So we send those to be cubed. I say literally just like cubed. And so they can't be used anymore. But otherwise, if they were replaced with like federal funds, we would just send them to roller auction basically at the end of their useful life or keep them for parts.
Sure. Do you think, based on your experience and your position out there, would an incentive as far as like a voluntary, kind of like the VW program, how it provides funds, if the Clean Transit Enterprise offered X number of percent more in funding for projects that included scrappage, like similar to VW, would that be of interest to your organization? Any thoughts about that in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would. Without speaking to the people above me, I can't give a definitive answer. But definitely, if it resulted in more funding available to the agencies, I would think for sure that would be the way that, you know, that we would like to pursue these grants. And, knowing that if we sent a bus to roller auction, we might get $3,000 for it. Now, keeping them for parts can be, fairly important. But Rick, yeah, I think you probably nailed it right on the head there, was saying if you offered more money for scrapping of the buses, we would take you up on that.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, and I have some experience with the Diesel Emission Reduction Act grant, and sometimes they allow, like the engine has to be scrapped, but all the other parts can be kept and used or even sold. So anyway, more food for thought. So thanks again for all the info and your responses. Really appreciate it. And great work out there.
Thank you.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I'll just add to the kudos for Andy. Obviously, great presentation. Also, Town of Breckenridge is a leader in the state when it comes to electrification of transit, and Andy himself is a leader in the sense that he is the co-chair of our Colorado EV Coalition Transit subgroup, and he does a lot of this great work, not just to do the work in Breckenridge, but to share it with others around the state and around the country. So appreciate that, Andy. So as we transition here, that's a great setup, I think, to this final topic of CTE planning grants. Andy mentioned in his presentation that they were funded by the precursor to this program. Before the CTE existed, we had Office of Innovative Mobility funding available for some of these transition plans. And hopefully his presentation highlighted a little bit about why these are important in setting agencies up to begin and then scale up their fleet transitions. Without a plan, it's a lot harder to do that. Desiree, if you could go to the next slide. So we've been working internally to try to get a sense of the landscape out there. And I'll be the first to admit that this data is not probably 100% accurate, but we're looking at all of the transit agencies in the state, the 80 plus entities that provide either open door or closed door service to a segment of the public that are eligible for CTE funding based on Senate Bill 260. And so there are about 80 of those, 80 plus, depending on where you draw that line. And approximately 12 of them that we know of have completed a ZEV fleet transition plan in a documented form. There are 5 others that we know of that are in the process of developing a plan. And then there are an additional 4 who have been awarded CDOT and or CTE funding to develop a plan, but have not yet begun it. So that leaves about 60 plus that, to our knowledge, have not started on this fleet transition planning process. And that gives us an opportunity through the CTE funding, the planning grants, to help those entities start the process. Our goal is to move agencies from the last category of haven't started yet into hopefully an award and then developing a plan and then eventually having a documented plan, because we believe that once they do that, they are better equipped to pursue infrastructure and vehicle and other funding to actually implement these projects. Next slide, please. So as you know, the Division of Transit and Rail at CDOT typically issues 2 calls for projects in a given year. One of them is a NOFA in the summer or fall for admin, operating, planning, and mobility management funding. So this includes the CTE planning grant opportunities. And then the other one that we talked about most recently is a second NOFA in the winter or spring for capital projects, which in the case of the CTE includes the infrastructure, facilities, and vehicle grants that we awarded a few months back. So looking ahead to fiscal year 25, we are hoping to open the next call for planning projects in November of this year, and then capital would follow in the winter or the spring of 2025. And in terms of the next call for projects, which I refer to here as round 2, we're hoping to make $750,000 available for planning for applicants. Next slide, please. So here are some of the details of the previous round, just to refresh your memory. So we had a target grant amount of between $25,000 and $50,000 per award, which you might recall lines up with what Andy described for their budget. It's not a hard cap or a hard minimum necessarily, but that is sort of the range that we think most transit agencies would fall into for developing a plan like this. There is a 10% match requirement for the awardees, but it can be either cash match or in-kind match, potentially, if they are short on cash. And we've also talked in the past about a process for the CTE board to waive the match requirement in certain circumstances. So just want to make that clear in case that comes up. The awardees are required to work with an outside consultant. So the intent of this is not that the board or the enterprise funds in-house work by existing agency staff. For a lot of the reasons that Andy described, it is very helpful to have an outside perspective, to have dedicated folks working on this who can work with your team, but not try to squeeze this into the day-to-day that transit agencies are trying to tackle. And then implementation timeline between 12 and 24 months from the notice to proceed. Ideally closer to the 12-month target, but we understand that there are mitigating circumstances for folks to, start and work through the planning process. And then we do give guidance on the elements that should be included in a transition plan. Some of the things Andy highlighted as well: fleet transition targets and timelines, route analysis, budgetary impacts and the level of resources needed, the workforce development implications of this change, coordination with electric utilities, potentially also with local governments or private sector partners that need to be involved in the planning and implementation, and then public engagement in support of all the above, because making sure that the riders and the public at large understands this transition and is supportive and gets their questions answered is also part of that. So next slide, please. And the way that we scored proposals, the committee that was formed to review requests in the previous round, the weighting was what you see there on the screen: 35% project need and benefit, 30% equity, inclusivity, and service to disproportionately impacted communities, and then project readiness, agency capacity, and application quality were all factored in. Readiness and agency capacity are a little bit lower, and in part that's because this is a planning effort, right? The plan is meant to build readiness and develop capacity. So we're not trying to penalize people if they don't have experience doing this yet. It's really about getting them the plan that starts them on that path. In previous planning rounds, there were generally more funds available than were requested. So it didn't really come down to awarding one proposal over another. It was more of a pass-fail based on the overall quality and proposal. But obviously, we would like to get to a point where we have so much demand that we have to make some of those hard decisions, but we're not there yet. And the scoring committee last time around included representatives from CDOT's Division of Transit and Rail, Office of Innovative Mobility, the Colorado Energy Office, Department of Public Health and Environment, our colleagues over at the National Renewable Energy Lab and representatives from CASTA. So we tried to have a balanced perspective on the scoring, not just in-house here at CDOT. Next slide, please. So based on the round one program details and scoring criteria that I shared, CDOT staff at this point are not recommending any fundamental changes to our process or approach. We think that it worked pretty well the last go around, and we'd like to kind of stay the course on that. We're of course open to board input or suggestions for changes there. And if the board is willing to endorse this approach, then CDOT staff will develop and schedule the release of the next NOFO for CTE planning. We'll coordinate with DTR on their broader NOFA, and that would be released in November of this year, so next month. And then calling back to the first slide, or the first couple slides, talking about there are about 60 some agencies in the state that we think are good candidates to take this step. And so we would do some targeted outreach to them, start building interest, and hopefully drive some of those applications so that we can get additional agencies into this process and hopefully help them develop a plan and then get on the road to transitioning their fleets. So I guess I will pause here, or we can go to the next slide, which is feedback and discussion. If there's any thoughts from the board on the proposed approach, any questions that I can answer, or anything else, I'll pause here.
Thanks, Mike. I have a question. Yeah, I think the sort of way y'all been thinking about how to score the proposals sounds right to me. I'm just thinking, like, zooming out big picture here. As a state, we have a goal to get to 1,000 zero emission transit vehicles by 2030, a little over 5 years away. What are we at now, like between 100 and 150 kind of ish?
We are around 78 on the road, and then another,
Okay.
I think 40 so that are on order or awarded.
Okay, gotcha.
So
yeah,
if you count everything, we're probably in 100 to 150. But as Andy pointed out, the timeline for those vehicles actually entering service is several years ahead of us.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah. So then thinking about, you said there's a little over 60 agencies that haven't done the electrification planning work yet. And within that, there's a handful of really large ones. Like the top kind of 5 transit agencies in the state are probably like 80% of all the vehicles in service. So I guess I'm just wondering what you're hearing from those larger transit agencies. We know RTD is doing their own fleet electrification plan, right? And then you've got, Mountain Metro, it's pretty big, 180 vehicles or so, Transport in Fort Collins, Mesa, Eagle County. What are we hearing from those?
Yeah, so off the top of my head, RTD is in the process of doing a plan right now. So they're one of the 5 in that category. Transfort, I believe, does have a documented fleet transition plan. So I think they are, that box is checked from our perspective. Mountain Metro is, I believe, probably the largest one that does not currently have a transition plan, to my knowledge. RAFTA, of course, has a plan. So in terms of, if we were to look at the list of 60, I think moving down that list based on size of the fleet might make sense for a variety of reasons in terms of, getting the ball rolling on more agencies. Some of the biggest are already, they have a plan. And so their challenge is slightly different. Their challenge is, pursuing infrastructure, pursuing chargers, potentially updating facilities. So yeah, I think we would certainly prioritize both in order of size, but also there are other factors that might indicate greater readiness to pursue electrics, depending on the service type, geography, what electric utility is serving that that agency, other things like that.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks for the overview. Any word from Eagle County or Core Transit now?
Yeah, they are both have at least a couple of EVs already, and I believe they have a plan. I would have to look at the list for who is in our group of 12. You also mentioned Grand Valley, and they they have a relatively large fleet. They also use compressed natural gas because they produce it locally. So that's an example of a fleet that might on paper look like a good candidate, but they have a broader question about, does it make sense for them to kind of switch pathways that they're on right now? And we are in conversations with them about the potential for an electrification plan and whether that fits in with their existing fuel supply.
Gotcha. Okay. And when you did talk to Mountain Metro in Colorado Springs, what's their sort of level of interest in electrification?
Well, they had a couple vehicles that they were piloting, and unfortunately, I think they've had a pretty rough experience with some of those. And so that is something that we are in conversations with them about. What is their appetite to, to continue that pursuit? What can we do to support them in dealing with the current vehicles and potentially adding new ones? But they unfortunately, I think began this process and had some negative experiences that maybe have slowed their progress. But that is certainly something we need to continue that conversation with them so we can support them.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dave.
Hey, thanks. Thanks, Michael. It's always great information. Just to kind of get to Matt's question about maybe some of the bigger agencies and then the other agencies, maybe middle-sized agencies and small agencies. My sense is that some of the big agencies that have made a move, or even the size of like Andy's operation in Breckenridge, is like that was a policy decision made by our governing board to transition to electric buses. And so they went for it. They're going for it to varying degrees of success. I think for some of the smaller agencies, and I'll just speak for SMART specifically, we looked very seriously at electric bus. I think we approached it a little bit differently in that we called it a feasibility study, and there was a transition plan that showed sort of a feasible path to electrification of the fleet. But there were some trade-offs, most of them really financial for us as a small agency. And I think the margin for error at a small agency is actually a lot smaller because we just don't have a deep bench of resources and backups and things like that. So I think that's what we're seeing is just maybe more caution at certain agencies than some of the bigger ones that, again, are getting policy directives and responding to a region-wide demand for this type of transition, or whatever. And I think it's all good either way, but I think that might help sort of frame why we're not seeing some interest from smaller agencies, that especially with the lack of cutaway until recently electric cutaways that a lot of the small agencies are trying to use and incorporate. So anyway, just food for thought.
No, I think that's an excellent point that you highlight. I guess the first thing that I should clarify for the board, and that I think it's really important that we clarify when we talk with agencies, is that developing a transition plan is not a commitment that the agency is going to go full electric or even begin that process immediately. I think that framing a planning grant as a feasibility study or an assessment or whatever version of that makes sense for a given agency, from my perspective, it is completely okay to go through that process and come to the conclusion that this is not a good fit for them today, and that's okay. What we are trying to encourage is for people to actually go through that process, ask the question, look at the data, have the conversation with their stakeholders, their staff, their passengers, and then come to a decision, even if that decision is maybe not the one that we would hope to see from the the statewide perspective. Because if people feel like they have to know that this is their future before they start the plan, they're not likely to do the plan. And they might learn something by doing the plan that helps them, get to that next step sooner than they might expect. And yeah, I think you're completely right that smaller agencies, they have fewer staff, they have less budget potentially. and the cost of an unsuccessful deployment is potentially higher because they don't have the fallback option. So I think these are all things that the board should be aware of, and I think that that agencies should recognize. But I still think there's an argument that if we can minimize the financial burden and the time burden for smaller agencies or more rural agencies to do this analysis, they will benefit from it in the long term. And it's not necessarily committing them to immediate, sweeping action in the way that some agencies will be ready to do that as soon as they have a plan, but others will not, and that's okay. One other thing I'll mention, there might also be opportunities for multiple agencies to plan together. I know of an example in the Crested Butte Gunnison area where two agencies are, sort of collaborating on this because they share some infrastructure. There could be other regional planning efforts or, similar agencies from different parts of the state that run similar types of service or use similar types of vehicles. So the category is pretty broad, and I think that we're really open to whatever form of planning support the agencies find useful. It's not a one size fits all, but yeah, just want to make that point as well. If there are no other questions and comments, I'm happy to turn it back to the chair, and we will, of course, update the board on our progress as we prepare and release a notice of funding availability, hopefully here in November. And then we would have some applications to review and discuss in early 2025.
All right, thanks, Mike. I just had one more question, just in case but for the RTD fleet electrification plan, do you know the timeline on that one?
I believe they are planning to publish the final document in December. So I will be reading that with great interest myself. And yes, I mean, it goes without saying that they are sort of the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to the number of transit vehicles in the state. So they could potentially have a clear direction at the end of this year.
Yeah, I was noticing that on the dashboard. You got the circles around the map of the state, and it's a little bit lonely in the Denver Metro. When you do find that plan, would you mind sharing it with the group?
Certainly.
Cool. All right, looks like that's our agenda for today. If anyone else had any updates, anything they want to share, big personal news, I don't know. Okay, not seeing anything, so we'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting, and see y'all next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.